The chamber was alive with restless energy, a mix of murmurs and hushed whispers echoing against the marble walls. Cameras hovered like watchful eyes, every lens waiting to catch the familiar spectacle. Raised voices, partisan jabs, another day of politics as usual. But this time the atmosphere carried a sharper edge, an unspoken sense that something different was about to unfold. At the center of it all sat Jasmine Crockett, poised yet unflinching, her presence a quiet storm. She wasn't there to perform. She wasn't there to trade empty barbs. She was there with testimony that cut deeper than sound bites, testimony born of truth, dignity, and lived experience. Her hands rested firmly on the desk, her voice steady as she prepared to speak. And in that instant, the noise of the chamber seemed to collapse into silence. Across the room, James Comer leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowed, arms crossed in the posture of someone bracing for a clash. His history with Crockett was well known. Clashes that had lit up headlines, moments that played out like theater where he was the skeptic, and she was the firebrand refusing to be silenced. Few expected him to do anything now but dismiss her words, roll his eyes, or sharpen his interruptions. The tension was palpable, the room itself becoming a stage for a story larger than the sum of its parts. One woman's voice against the weight of cynicism and arrogance. And as Crockett began, her words cut through the stillness like a blade. Her tone was calm, her cadence deliberate, but there was a force behind every syllable, a force that demanded to be heard, that refused to be minimized. The gallery watched intently, eyes darting between Crockett and Comer, waiting for the inevitable clash, waiting for Comer to sneer, to interrupt, to reclaim the role of villain he had played so many times before. But then, something shifted. It was subtle at first, the tilt of his head, the narrowing of his gaze, not in dismissal but in focus. For a heartbeat, Comer wasn't posturing. He was listening. No one expected what James Comer would do next. But within minutes the air shifted, and the entire chamber braced for something no one saw coming. For years James Comer had built a reputation as the sharp-tongued inquisitor of the House chamber, a man quick to cut off, quick to belittle, quick to grind testimony into partisan dust. His style wasn't subtle. It was aggressive, relentless, designed to remind those in his crosshairs who truly held the gavel. Supporters praised his toughness, his refusal to yield an inch. Critics called it arrogance, a performance of power rather than pursuit of truth. Either way, the expectation was always the same. When Comer entered the room, civility exited, and few had felt the sting of that posture more than Jasmine Crockett. She was no stranger to the hostile spotlight. Time and again, her attempts to bring substance to hearings had been met with interruptions, dismissals, and condescending remarks. In a chamber that often prized theatrics over honesty, she carved her identity as the rare figure who spoke not for performance, but from conviction. Her voice carried weight not because it was the loudest, but because it was anchored in something deeper, the lived experience of fighting for communities often written out of America's story. Still, that role came at a cost. Too often, Crockett was underestimated, framed by her opponents as too passionate, too combative, or too much. Those labels were weapons, tools meant to undermine not just her arguments but her very presence. Yet every time she pushed back with dignity and tact, proving that authenticity could withstand even the most hostile spotlight. This testimony, though, was different. It wasn't simply another hearing. It wasn't another opportunity for Comer to grandstand or another occasion for Crockett to endure. The stakes were bigger than either nameplate on the desk. The chamber that day became a reflection of a divided America, an America where identity had become ammunition, where voices like Crockett's were too often drowned out by partisan noise. Her presence was more than symbolic. It was essential. She represented the millions who had been told they didn't belong, who had been told to wait their turn, who had been told to stay quiet while power played games with their futures. And on the other side sat Comer, emblem of a politics that thrived on division, who wore his partisanship like armor. The clash was inevitable, and the audience knew it. But as Crockett spoke, her calm presence wasn't just a rebuttal to arrogance. It was a challenge to the entire performance of politics itself. The chamber leaned in, waiting for Comer's infamous spark, the interruption, the belittling quip. Instead, something else began to stir. Because this moment, unlike any before, would not play out along the old, predictable lines. This testimony had the power to pierce through performance and force even Comer to confront the weight of dignity. And yet this moment would prove different, so different it shocked even Comer himself. James Comer's rise in Congress was never about quiet persuasion or careful diplomacy. His reputation was forged in the heat of partisan combat, where volume often replaced substance and aggression, masqueraded as strength. To his allies, he was the bulldog they wanted in the fight, a man unafraid to sneer, to cut, to dominate. To his critics, he embodied everything corrosive about modern politics. Arrogance dressed up as leadership, bluster masking a void where statesmanship should have been. Again and again, Comer had made his name not by building coalitions but by tearing them down. In committee hearings, his tone was dismissive, his questions loaded with insinuations rather than substance. He was the man who would roll his eyes mid-sentence, who would talk over witnesses, who seemed less interested in the pursuit of truth than in the performance of dominance. The gavel in his hand was not a tool of order. It was a weapon, and every swing of it carried the same message. I control this stage, but control has its limits and arrogance has its cracks. For every display of swagger, there were moments Comer could not quite control. The gaffes that turned hearings into viral mockeries, the contradictions that exposed his double standards. He could rail against accountability one day, only to stumble into ethical questions of his own the next. He could present himself as the sober guardian of oversight, while indulging in the very theatrics he claimed to despise. The chamber knew it, the press knew it, and in truth so did Comer. That tension fueled his clashes with Jasmine Crockett. She was his opposite in every way that mattered. Where he projected arrogance, she embodied authenticity. Where he wielded interruptions, she wielded facts. Where he dismissed, she endured. Their confrontations were never merely procedural. They were cultural lightning rods. Each time Comer tried to reduce her, Crockett's resilience transformed the moment into proof that she could not be diminished. Still, Comer thrived on the performance. The more outrage Crockett inspired from his side of the aisle, the more he leaned into his role as her foil. To many viewers, he became the caricature of political arrogance, the man who laughed when he should have listened, who jeered when he should have reflected. And yet, beneath the arrogance, there was an unspoken vulnerability, the recognition that his bluster worked only so long as others accepted the script. Because arrogance, for all its noise, is fragile. It depends on the silence of others. It depends on witnesses cowering, colleagues acquiescing, the audience buying into the illusion of control. The moment someone refuses to play along, the performance falters. And when the performance falters, the man behind the arrogance is suddenly exposed. That exposure was coming. It was inevitable. For all his history of dismissing, mocking, and posturing, Comer had never faced a testimony like the one Jasmine Crockett was about to deliver. Hers would not be another performance to spar against. Hers would be a truth spoken with such clarity, such unshakable dignity, that the old tricks, the interruptions, the eye rolls, the derision would collapse under its weight. The arrogance had carried him far. But arrogance has a breaking point, and it was Jasmine Crockett who would push him to it. Long before the bright lights of Congress, Jasmine Crockett's story was written in the quiet resilience of someone who had to fight for every inch of ground she stood on. Born and raised in Dallas, she understood early what it meant to be underestimated, to have her presence questioned in rooms that were not built for her. She carried the double weight of being both black and a woman in spaces where power had long been hoarded by others. Yet what could have silenced her instead forged her into someone who refused to bow. Her path began not in politics but in law, defending those society was quickest to discard. As a public defender, she bore witness to the crushing inequities of a justice system that too often punished poverty and color more than crime itself. Day after day, she stood beside clients no one else would fight for, her voice their only shield against a machinery designed to grind them down. These early battles did more than sharpen her skills. They carved into her an unshakable belief that justice wasn't just an abstract principle, it was a lifeline. That belief propelled her into politics, though the path was anything but smooth. In Texas, she faced the sneers of those who dismissed her as too bold or too loud, labels often attached to black women whose only crime was refusing to be silent. But Crockett wore those labels as armor. She turned mockery into momentum, proving that fearlessness in the face of hostility could be more powerful than any title. Her arrival in Congress did not soften her fire. If anything, it amplified it. In hearings, she confronted hypocrisy head-on, dismantling bad faith arguments with the precision of a lawyer and the passion of someone who had lived the stakes. Every interruption she endured, every smirk cast her way only deepened her resolve. Viewers across the country began to recognize her as something rare. A representative who carried herself not like a politician chasing applause, but like a woman anchored in dignity, unwilling to let arrogance dictate the terms of debate. And it wasn't just the content of her words that resonated. It was the way she carried herself. Even in the face of ridicule, her posture remained steady, her tone calm, her conviction unyielding. That steadiness became its own form of resistance. In a world where politics had become theater, Jasmine Crockett refused to play the caricature. She was not there to entertain. She was there to tell the truth. It was this integrity that made her clashes with figures like James Comer so electric. He thrived on belittlement, but she thrived on clarity. Where he performed for the cameras, she spoke for those who rarely had a seat at the table. Their exchanges revealed more than personal animosity. They revealed the deeper fault lines of America itself: arrogance versus authenticity, dismissal versus dignity. And time after time, Crockett showed that dignity could not be mocked out of existence. Her supporters saw her as a mirror of themselves: immigrants, workers, women, people of color, anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. Watching her stand tall in that chamber was more than politics. It was validation. Validation that truth, when spoken with courage, could break through even the thickest wall of arrogance. But what made her testimony on this day so different, so unshakable, wasn't just the stack of facts she brought to the table. It was the weight of her journey, the countless times she had been silenced, doubted, interrupted, only to rise again stronger. Every word she spoke carried the history of those battles. Every pause was a reminder of the silence she had endured. Every glance toward Comer was a declaration: I am still here, and I will be heard. Her presence was not just political, it was personal, generational, universal. And in that moment, the chamber would learn what it meant to face someone whose power was rooted, not in arrogance, but in a lifetime of resilience. What made her testimony so unshakable was not just facts, but a lifetime of fighting to be heard. The stillness of the chamber was almost unsettling as Jasmine Crockett leaned into the microphone. Her tone carried no hint of theatrics: calm, factual, unyielding. Each sentence rolled out like a carefully measured stone, landing with weight, leaving no room for dismissal. She wasn't there to spar nor debate. She was there to lay bare a truth that could not be ignored. At first, the rhythm felt familiar. Comer leaned back, arms folded, his face a mask of practiced impatience. To anyone watching, it was the posture of a man waiting for his moment to pounce. The gallery braced for the familiar script: a scoff, an eye roll, an interruption designed to fracture her flow. But that moment didn't come. Instead, Comer's gaze locked on her words, his jaw tightening with each passing sentence. Crockett's testimony was not fiery. It was sharper than fire. She spoke with the precision of a scalpel, cutting through the fog of partisan spin. The facts she delivered were not cloaked in anger. They were presented with a quiet authority that stripped the chamber of its usual noise. Her composure itself was the weapon. And in that silence, every flicker of Comer's reaction became its own spectacle. At times his brow furrowed as though the weight of her logic pressed harder than he anticipated. At other moments his lips parted slightly, the instinct to interrupt flickering only to be swallowed by something unfamiliar: hesitation. Members of the committee leaned forward, sensing the shift. It wasn't just Crockett speaking. It was Comer, too, revealing in his body language a rare vulnerability. The tension grew with every word she spoke. Staffers exchanged glances, reporters scribbled furiously, and the audience online began to pulse with speculation. Was Comer rattled? Was this the moment Crockett would finally corner him, not with volume, but with unshakable truth? Her words carried the cadence of inevitability. There was no pause for applause, no search for validation. She spoke as if validation had already been won, as if her very presence in that chair was proof enough. And with every passing minute, the chamber leaned further into her gravity. Comer shifted again, this time leaning forward, elbows pressing against the table. His face betrayed a battle between instinct and reason. the instinct to reassert control clashing with the reason that told him any interruption would only underscore her strength. The room seemed to freeze on the possibility. Would he break character or double down on the arrogance that defined him? The suspense was unbearable, the entire hearing hanging on the knife's edge of what he would do. The villain everyone knew suddenly seemed unsettled, and just when everyone thought he'd dismiss her, Comer did something no one predicted. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her eyes steady, her voice carrying the calm of someone who had already rehearsed every possible interruption, and found none of them worth her fear. What came next was not noise. It was not a fiery outburst. It was a methodical dismantling of pretense, laid brick by brick with surgical precision. She began with the facts, dates, records, testimony already buried under layers of partisan spin. But in Crockett's hands, these weren't just statistics. They were stories. Each point was anchored in a human consequence, every number tethered to the lives of people who could not sit in that chamber. She spoke of families broken by policies wielded like weapons, of communities dismissed until they became punchlines. The details were undeniable, stripped of the political varnish Comer so often used as cover. The silence was deafening. Even the usual shuffle of papers and low coughs that filled the background of hearing seemed to vanish. Staffers froze mid-note. Reporters stopped mid-scribble. The audience in the gallery leaned forward as though straining not to miss a syllable. And Comer sat locked in place, his arms no longer folded, his posture leaning ever so slightly toward her voice. Crockett paused deliberately, letting her words hang in the air like a weight the room could not shake off. That pause itself became a statement. She was not rushing, not pleading for permission to finish, not waiting for interruption. She owned the silence, forcing every listener to sit with the truth before she moved on. In those pauses, the chamber became theater. Her opponents shifted in their seats, discomfort creeping across their faces. Her allies exchanged faint, knowing smiles, and outside the walls the country was already buzzing. On social media, clips of her testimony began to circulate in real time, hashtags forming, captions declaring, "Listen to Jasmine Crockett. This is what truth sounds like." Viewers watching live streams tweeted disbelief that Comer had yet to cut in. Others marveled at the composure in her tone, the elegance of a dismantling that required no theatrics. And then came the pivot, the moment her testimony moved from facts to principle. Crockett shifted her cadence, no longer just presenting evidence but framing it within a larger moral truth. She spoke of dignity, of the obligation of leaders to protect rather than prey, of the America that so many believed in but too few in power practiced. Her voice, calm but commanding, made the chamber feel less like a hearing and more like a courtroom of history itself. Comer's face betrayed the struggle. His jaw worked as though words were fighting to escape, but no interruption came. His usual tactics, dismissing, mocking, derailing, suddenly seemed inadequate. Every attempt to interrupt would have only amplified her strength. Every jab would have made him appear smaller in contrast. So he sat and listened. The effect was electric. To see the man who so often thrived on control reduced to silence by nothing more than composure. It was more powerful than any shouted retort could have been. Crockett did not need to defeat him loudly. She defeated him by rendering him powerless to play the part he had written for himself. The chamber felt it. Members glanced at Comer, then back at Crockett, the shift undeniable. Reporters began typing not just about her words, but about his silence. Social media feeds lit up with comments. Even Comer can't touch her. He's stuck, he has to respect it. This is history. As Crockett neared her close, her words gained momentum. Not speed, not volume, momentum. Each line built on the last, a steady crescendo that carried the weight of every voice she represented. She reminded the chamber that dignity could not be erased, that arrogance could not bury truth forever, that the America her constituents believed in was still worth fighting for. And then, she delivered it, the line that would echo beyond those walls, the one clipped and replayed millions of times. Her words didn't just pierce arguments, they pierced arrogance itself. The silence that followed was total. Comer's shoulders sank slightly, his expression less the mask of a fighter and more the look of a man who had been forced, if only for a moment, to see beyond himself. It wasn't surrender. It wasn't defeat. It was respect, raw, reluctant, undeniable. In that respect, fleeting though it was, the chamber felt the tectonic shift. The villain had not been conquered by volume but by dignity. And the hero, underestimated so many times before, had not only held her ground but forced even her greatest antagonist to acknowledge it. The moment wasn't just a mic drop. It was a seismic crack in the script of politics itself. And the aftershocks were only beginning. For a moment the chamber remained frozen, as though time itself had stumbled. Then came the stirrings, murmurs rippling through the room, a cough here, a shuffle there, the scratch of pens against paper suddenly frantic as journalists raced to capture what had just unfolded. Some members leaned into one another in hushed whispers, their faces registering the same disbelief the audience outside the chamber was already voicing. The air was charged, unsettled as if everyone present knew they had just witnessed something rare, a breach in the script of politics. Comer had not lashed out. He had not diminished. He had listened. And Jasmine Crockett's words still lingered, heavy as stone echoing against the walls long after her microphone had gone silent. Reporters wasted no time. Tweets began to fly within seconds, phrases like Crockett stuns Comer and respect in real time flashing across feeds. Headlines drafted in hurried keystrokes captured the reversal. Comer, known for clashes, silenced by Crockett's poise. The usual pundits who thrived on drama found themselves pivoting, forced to acknowledge that this moment could not be spun as business as usual. On social media, the explosion was instant and volcanic. Clips of Crockett's testimony spread like wildfire. Within minutes, hashtags were trending nationwide. Bonger Crockett truth, daughter respect earned, and even the ironic, or Comer listens. Memes appeared in real time, split-screen images of Comer's stony face alongside captions like, "When the truth finally hits," or "This is what listening looks like." But the praise wasn't confined to Crockett's allies. Commentators who had long been critical of her style, even those on opposing networks, began to nod at the undeniable gravity of her performance. One conservative columnist admitted live on air, "You don't often see Comer sit silent." If nothing else, today showed that even he recognized the weight of her testimony. Others described it as a rare rupture in the wall of partisan arrogance, a glimpse of respect where none was expected. For her supporters, the validation was electric. Immigrant families, young activists, marginalized communities who had watched her endure mockery and dismissal shared the clips with pride. "She speaks for us," one viral post read, and today even he had to hear it. The comments beneath flooded with affirmation, emojis of fire, fists, flags, and tears. For once, politics felt less like a spectacle and more like a mirror. Inside the chamber, Comer's silence became its own story. Journalists circled. Colleagues eyed him with curiosity, even suspicion. Was it respect? Was it strategy? Did it matter? What mattered was that the narrative had shifted. Comer, the habitual interrupter, the embodiment of dismissive power, had been forced into a new role, not by choice, but by the sheer force of Crockett's dignity. Cable news lit up that evening with split screens and looping footage. Analysts dissected every flicker of Comer's expression, every pause in Crockett's cadence. The question repeated across broadcasts was simple. What does it mean when even Comer listens? The tone was less partisan, more reverent, as though the moment had breached politics and entered the realm of cultural significance. Because this wasn't just about one clash in one chamber. It was about the possibility that dignity, once displayed with enough clarity, could demand respect even from those least likely to give it. It was about the hope that America's divided politics might still hold cracks where truth could shine through. The ripple effect was undeniable. Late-night hosts crafted monologues around it. Celebrities retweeted the clips. Civic groups adopted Crockett's words as rallying cries. The story had transcended the hearing room. It had become a cultural moment. But beneath all the noise and celebration, a deeper question lingered, one that gave the moment its true weight. Because it wasn't just about James Comer's silence or even about Jasmine Crockett's strength. It was about what this respect meant for the country. In the days that followed, Jasmine Crockett's testimony was replayed again and again, not merely as political theater but as something deeper, an affirmation that truth, delivered with dignity, can still pierce the noise. The image of Comer listening, uncharacteristically still, uncharacteristically silent, took on a meaning larger than either figure. It became a reminder that respect is not granted by position or party, but compelled by principle. For Crockett, this was never about winning a clash. It was about affirming that the American experiment survives only when voices long pushed aside refuse to be silenced. Her words were less a rebuttal to Comer than a rebuke to an entire culture of dismissal, the habit of treating certain Americans as less worthy, less legitimate, less heard. And by holding her ground with poise, she demonstrated that dignity is not weakness, it is power. Narrators of history often speak of moments where nations pivot, not in grand revolutions but in the small ruptures that reveal what is possible. This was one of those ruptures. In a chamber where arrogance had long reigned, dignity cracked the armor. In a country where division has been weaponized, a brief flicker of respect proved contagious. The lesson was not that James Comer changed, or that one exchange healed a nation. The lesson was simpler yet profound. Truth spoken with integrity can demand acknowledgement, even from the most unlikely ears. In that recognition lies the seed of democracy's resilience. Crockett's testimony became more than a defense of herself or her community. It became a reflection of America's unfinished promise, that no matter how high the walls of arrogance, dignity can still echo loud enough to shake them. She turned a confrontation into a parable, one that immigrant families, young activists, and weary citizens alike could hold on to. That respect is not begged for, but earned through courage. As commentators tried to parse what it meant, her words offered clarity. It meant that the struggle continues, but not without hope. It meant that division does not have to be destiny. It meant that dignity, wielded with steadiness, is still America's most radical weapon. And in the hushed silence that followed her testimony, the moral emerged clear. When even rivals recognize dignity, that is when democracy breathes again. The chamber froze that day and the nation held its breath. James Comer, long a figure of derision and dismissiveness, had listened, and Jasmine Crockett, so often underestimated, had turned her testimony into a moment of undeniable power. No one expected his respect. No one foresaw his silence. Yet when it came, it shocked not just the chamber, but the country watching beyond its walls. This was more than politics. It was proof that resilience and truth can cut through even the thickest walls of partisanship. Crockett's strength reminded us all that dignity does not need permission to speak. It only needs the courage to endure. And when endurance meets truth, even the loudest critics are forced to quiet. But this moment doesn't belong only to Crockett and Comer. It belongs to every viewer who refuses to accept that division is destiny. It belongs to you, the ones who share, who comment, who lift stories like these into the spotlight so the nation cannot look away. Because every replay, every conversation, every shared clip is part of a movement. The movement to remind America what respect truly looks like. So if you believe that dignity matters, if you believe that resilience can still pierce arrogance, then join us. Subscribe, share this story, and add your voice in the comments below. Let the ripple of this moment reach farther than any single chamber. Because respect once earned cannot be ignored.